الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وكفى والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه أما بعد. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Right. So the readings for today was from page 48 to 52, and this chapter of Tahara started on page 41. I'm not sure if we actually had gone through any questions from that section. If anybody had any questions, but we can do that also. But today's reading was from 48 to 52, and then the slides themselves are very little for today. If we finish early, inshallah, we'll continue with Creed, so that we can get some more done. We'll have class as usual tomorrow.
I think that we did ask questions from last time.
Okay. So today's reading is about the obligatory bath, right? And tayammum, essentially. Any questions? Yes.
On page 48, when it's talking about the photo of ghusl, it says washing whatever is possible without undue difficulty or hardship of the entire body once. And this element is different than the sunnahs. And the sunnah also says washing one's private parts. So my question is, when it's the farther part and saying washing what's possible, is this the washing that we kind of went over last week, which just, I don't know, you have to get like more than a few drips on the limb?
So this is a bath, so it's with more water. The difference between number 3 on page 48, right, and all of the sunnahs mentioned on page 49 is that 49 or the list on page 49, the sunnahs ensure that every individual part of the body gets attention. Every individual part of the body gets attention, whereas the third integral mentioned on page 48 is all of them combined, right? And when you are washing your entire body, as it mentions in the footnote, we're talking about, the things that are reachable without difficulty, or the things that are reachable, without hardship. So person might have to stretch and make some effort, but they're not necessarily impossible. Unlike, for example, when someone's long hair is braided, right? Then the roots of the hair have to be all wet, and that is going to take some effort to ensure that through the braids, right, the scalp of the person is getting washed, right? So that's going to be slightly difficult, but beyond that, everything else is considered to be within the realm of just taking a shower, right? So there are certain parts of the body where there might be najasa, there might be impurities, dried or stuck, right? And a person just has to make sure that those areas are taken care of, right? Because the purpose of an obligatory bath obviously is to come out of a state of major impurity, right? So this is for men and women. So in order to come out of the state of impurity, a person has to ensure that all of the components of the ghusl of the bath are actually done properly, right? And beyond that is just ensuring that no um, um, impurities remain on a person, right? Which is why the definition of washing that we learned last week for wudu doesn't apply here because you're trying to use enough water to ensure that every part of your body is properly taken care of, right? Which is not possible if you're using very little water, like how you would for wudu.
So when the Prophet says wash whatever is possible, and the Sunnah says wash the private part, wouldn't you have already washed?
So the sunnahs focus on individual parts where a person may not give much attention, or by following the sunnah, a person is just systematically making sure that everything is being done. Again, you have to keep in mind the context in which the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ makes sense, which is when people would take baths by using smaller utensils, drawing from a bucket, from a river, from a stream, whatever it is, and pouring it over themselves, or being in a river or being in a stream, right? And pouring water over themselves. The equivalent today would be standing in a bathtub and using a bucket and using a jug to, pour water over yourself. When you're doing something like that, you're doing it manually and you're not doing all at once, which means that you need to give individual attention. So the Prophet ﷺ's sunan, before the obligatory bath. So if you go through it on page 49, intention. So this intention, of course, it's not an obligation. It's not a prerequisite, unlike the other madahib. For the Hanafis, it's not necessary for you to have an intention to do ghusl, but it's part of the sunnah. And a person washing hands until the wrists, right? What's the purpose of that? So in the books of fiqh, they'll mention that if any of your hands have impurities, you are ensuring that your hands are first washed so that you don't transfer impurities from your hand to anywhere else when you are using your hands to wash your body. So what do? So you basically use a little bit of your right hand to scoop water out, wash your left hand, and then you use your washed left hand to scoop water out and wash your right hand. Does that make sense? This ensures that your hands are clean. And now when you're using your hands to wash other parts of the body, you're not going to transfer impurities from them. Does that make any sense? Number 3, you wash your private parts because that's where the najasa, the impurities might be. Number 4, washing off any general filth from any other part of the body. Right? Why is that part of the sunnah? Simply because if you were to take care of those individual parts, with little water, when you're washing off your entire body, you don't have to give individual attention at that time. It's simply just making sure that every other part has been washed, right? And once you wash off any filth from your body, number 5, you perform wudu. Why do you do wudu? Because you end up rinsing your nose and you end up rinsing your mouth during wudu in the beginning, which is 2 of the integrals of your obligatory bath, right? Because the fard is you rinse your mouth, you rinse your nose, right? And you wash your entire body. If you start your ghusl with wudu, you've already done 2 of the 3. And those 2 are the ones that tend to get left out, or the ones that people don't remember, or the ones that people are not aware of. So when you do the sunnah first, you end up doing 2 of the 3 integrals, right? The ones that you have to do. And then when you wash your entire body, your ghusl is done. Does that make sense? Which, again, might not be something that we really need to pay attention to today because we have shower heads, we're standing under shower heads, for example, where, the water is being poured all over our body, right? If you read through the description of taking ghusl, they'll mention, for example, using your left hand to hold the jug and pouring water over the right side of your body, over your right shoulder, and then using the right hand to pour it over your left shoulder, and then pouring water over the middle of your body. Why do it that way? You're trying to do it that way so that you don't leave any part of your body out by accident. Because if you just pour from the middle, then you might leave out something on the sides. Mm. Mhm. Any other questions? Yeah.
On page 39, first it said that, to make ghusl before Jumu'ah is, Nawafil, and then, in the footnotes, it said that it was Sunnah Mu'akkada. So could you, clarify what the two is?
Well, nafil simply means that it's optional. It's something that the Prophet did consistently as his own practice, but if a person is not able to, then it's no harm.
And then but then in the footnotes, he says it actually is Sunnah Mu'akkada, which if we did leave it would be some harm, right?
Which footnote is that?
Footnote number 92, the last sentence. Oh no, I'm sorry, hold on. Footnote 91, last sentence.
Okay. So it's an emphasized sunnah, not merely recommended. So again, they fall within the same category as we saw when we first started legal values, right? That you have the mandub category, which is recommended, and within the recommended category, you have emphasized sunnah, and you have all the other non-emphasized sunnah and optional actions, right? So if you categorize them as slightly higher, it would simply be because of the acts that they are associated with. So taking a bath on Friday because of Jumu'ah, the two Eids because they are the days of Eid, days of celebration. Number three, before you enter in the state of Ihram, to just ensure that you are on the best of states. Number four, Arafah, because it's the day of Arafah, you kind of rejuvenate yourself to do ibadah and to take advantage of the day. It could be for those reasons, but they're still part of the overall recommended category because you're not going to say it's anything more than that or anything less than that.
But if somebody, just last week, for saying, for example, like somebody doesn't do a Sunnah Mu'akkada, they're just sitting on their phone and they have time to do it.
We're talking, so those are worship related, right? So that's the distinction, right? When we talk about Sunnah Mu'akkada, not every Sunnah Mu'akkada is going to be worship related, right? So if it's not worship related, then you're not going to consider it the same way. So if a person, doesn't take a shower on Friday morning before Jummah, it's not the same as not praying your 4 rakat sunnahs of Dhuhr.
And why is ghusl not considered worship related?
Well, it's a natural act of just cleanliness, but doing it on the day of Jumu'ah is more so for the Jumu'ah, not because of the act itself, right? Because ghusl on any other day doesn't hold the same weight because it's just on any other day. But when you do it on a Friday, you're doing it because it's a Friday.
Is there a tradition where like Prophet Muhammad was given a khutbah, and then Uthman came and did something about a ghusl and going to Jumu'ah?
I'll have to look into it. Okay. Any other questions? So readings from pages 48 to 52. Questions before we get started with the slides. This is, of course, assuming you guys have done the reading. Which, if I wasn't doing personal plan, I'd say majority of you haven't. So, one thing that so a couple of things I want to clarify before we get into the slides. The first one on page 50 under the ghusl is not necessary after any of the following. Okay, so this is going to come up. This is going to come up on the slides, but the first one, the exit of madhi or wadi. Madhi or wadi, basically, madhi is what we call pre-sexual fluid. Wadi is something that comes oftentimes alongside or after urination. Both of those break the wudu, but do not require ghusl. Okay. The second one, this is going to be explained on the slides as well. If a person wakes up and they feel like, or they think, or they remember seeing what we call, a wet dream, but they don't find any evidence on their clothes of emission, then they don't have to do ghusl because it's based on whether or not you see any evidence of it. All right. Number three, basically a suppository or anything of its type being inserted into any of the private parts do not break your ghusl or do not require ghusl, but won't require wudu either. Okay. This is on page 50. This is under the ghusl is not necessary after any of the following. The last one might seem like a very weird thing to have in a book of fiqh, but keep in mind that the fuqaha would basically include hypothetical scenarios as a type of thought exercise, kind of thinking through the logical reasoning of one thing and trying to applying it to another. So obviously this is a hypothetical, hopefully. That doesn't require ghusl either. The rules that you find in a book of fiqh, a lot of them are basically consequential reasoning, which is if you come to a conclusion about an answer, if you come to a conclusion about a question that you are thinking about or that you've been asked about, you kind of take it further just to see what the implications would be in case other questions like it come up. That's the job of a jurist, that you kind of think through and continue to generate rulings. So a lot of times things would be hypothetical scenarios that would be considered so that there's some precedent or there's some basis in order to think about it much later. Right? Okay. For tayammum, a lot of these are going to be explained on the slides as well, but I want to focus on the first point under tayammum, which is being roughly 1 Hashemite legal mile away from water. Okay, so when we find units of measurement within the hadith, it's very difficult to do a conversion and to know exactly what the Prophet was talking about. Because the Prophet ﷺ, for example, in the hadith will sometimes say the distance of 1 day of travel. Does that make sense? The distance of 1 day of travel. However, travel in those days were by foot or by animal. And our travel is much faster in much shorter of a time. So how do you translate, how do you convert what the Prophet ﷺ mentions as a unit of measurement? So 1 Hashemite legal mile, if you look at footnote 93, this distance is estimated to be about a half-hour walk. Now, a half-hour walk is not the same for everyone, because some people walk fast, some people walk slow, right? So how do you exactly measure a half-hour walk? What if you have to wait 10 minutes just for traffic to stop so you can walk across? Right? Versus you just walking in a straight line with no obstructions or anything like that. All of those things change what we would consider to be a half-hour walk. So a reasonable likelihood of this distance is sufficient for tayammum to be possible. Okay, so in the point itself, the author, Shafaraz, who's the translator, he says 1.16 miles. All right, so about 1.16, 1.2 miles, that's considered to be sufficiently far enough from water for you to consider tayammum. Okay. Yes.
I got two questions. One on this. What if you're like in the suburbs and there's actually water around you? People have hoses and things like that, but I guess there's no store near you, hypothetically, and you're not like at your house or destination to where you could have water, and you are walking.
Yeah.
Would that be considered a time where you could use or could do tayammum if you don't actually have access to?
So it depends, right? So for example, if you look at the second to last point on page 51, lack of apparatus to take water out of the well. So there is water, but there's no way for you to access the water. So say, for example, you're in a neighborhood, but there's no way that you can purchase water. You don't have water on you, and you're not sure if you can go up to someone's house and say, hey, can I use your hose? Right? You don't know what kind of reception you might get. So if a person is reasonably certain that they're going to be refused water, which, it's for the most part, it's not something that people would refuse, right? But if a person is certain that they might be refused, then tayammum at that time will be considered an option. But you have to exhaust all your options first before you jump into considering tayammum, right?
Being refused, like, feeling it would be creepy, or that you'd be, just looked at weirdly. Is that enough to?
I think it depends. So, whether a person's discomfort should be taken into account or not, because we feel discomfort, and very, very self-conscious in public about doing wudu, praying salah, things like that. A lot of people might say, for example, oh, can I do tayammum if there's only a public restroom and I have to wash my feet in the sink and somebody might see me? That type of discomfort doesn't qualify you to do tayammum. Oh, I might be looked at weirdly if I'm praying next to my car in the parking lot. But if it's a reasonable amount of fear where you're on your own, and you being outside your car and praying might not be, might attract, unwanted attention, where somebody might get aggressive, then perhaps praying inside the car would be better in that scenario, right? But if a person is with family, then praying outside, is possible, right? Regardless of what others might say. So whether or not somebody might think of you weird for asking for water is something up to your judgment, right? If somebody's kind of on their lawn and they seem friendly enough, and you, for example, have like an empty gallon or something, you say, hey, can I just fill up some water from your hose? And if they're open for it, then yeah, you do that, right? But if it's like there's nobody around and you don't want to just go up to a random house and get shot at, because some people, be that trigger happy, then yeah, that might be a reasonable excuse for you to do tayammum.
To go back to Madi, so if somebody has Madi, they have to then purify themselves with wudu before they make salah.
Yeah, so it breaks your wudu, but it doesn't require ghusl. And if it gets on any of the clothing, then that part of the clothing has to be washed also.
So you also have to wash your private parts before you before you mix a lot.
If it's necessary, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So we'll get started with the slides. Again, not too much in terms of the slides today. I kind of didn't want to get into the wiping over socks, which is going to be next week. Inshallah, that's going to definitely take some time. I want to keep that separate so the slides themselves didn't get too long. So once we're done with the slides for today, we will continue with our Creed class, which we started last week, Signs of the Day of Judgment. Hopefully, if we do a little today, we can finish it tomorrow. Inshallah. Okay. Also, as I've been saying for, I think majority of you have submitted your midterms. If you have not yet submitted your midterm, then it's because you asked me for an extension. However, I've been mentioning over the course of an entire month, perhaps, that all the slides and everything that I use in class are going to be on Google Classroom. If you're in a panic and reaching out to Sister Sarah night before the exam is due, asking how to get into Google Classroom, that speaks volumes about your, habits as a student. It's not a good look. So if you don't have access to Google Classroom yet, you should let me know so that an invite can be sent to you so that you have access to the slides. All right. All right. So okay. So week 8, Tahara is going to be for another 4 weeks probably. In some of the slides, there's going to be contemporary stuff added, which are not, which is not mentioned in the books, kind of as a supplementary because these kind of questions come up for us. Right. So in brief, just to go over the Fard Ghusl, again, the slides will make sense if you've done the reading. Okay. So our Fard Ghusl, obligatory bath, is the one that you have to do in order to do anything else. The reason why we call it an obligatory integral, or the reason why we call it an obligatory bath, is because in order for you to do something else, you have to do this first, right? Obligatory integral simply means the main parts of something, right? So the terminology in the book, it's a little clunky, but this is basically translation of things like rukn, of things like fard, and the terminology that comes up in the books of fiqh, right? So obligatory integral means something that must be done for an action to be valid, which are the 3 things that you have to do in order for your Fard Ghusl to be considered valid, for your Fard Ghusl to allow you to now do any other act of worship. And it is also what sets the Fard Ghusl apart from other types of ghusl. Because other types of ghusl might be like a quick, bath where you are just rinsing yourself off because you got sweaty, for example. You might not necessarily wash your hair, right? Or if you do wash your hair, you might not be doing it that thoroughly, for example. You might just have a quick rinse off after coming out of the pool, or after taking a dip in the ocean, right? So all of those are considered showers, right? All different types of showers, but this one sets itself apart because you have to be very, very thorough, and basically making sure that no physical remnants of impurities are left on your body. And B, you have to make sure that you do the 3 obligatory integrals, which is rinsing your mouth, rinsing your nose, all right, and washing the entire body. So why is the mouth and nose mentioned separately? Because that's part of your body. However, it's not a place where water goes naturally. When a person jumps into a pool, for example, they might hold their nose, they might keep their mouth shut, right? So that you don't inhale or drink a lot of water accidentally. When you're under a shower head taking a ghusl, your nostrils are facing downwards. That means water is not going up. Your mouth is usually closed, or water is not going to go into it naturally. So you have to ensure that your mouth is rinsed and your nose is also rinsed out. This is one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, doing the sunan, right, doing the sunnahs before the ghusl ensures that a person's mouth and nose is already rinsed, right? Because wudu, which is one of the sunnah, is to basically ensure that, or part of the wudu is that a person's mouth and nose is being washed off, right? We talked about what it means to wash the entire body, right? A person has to ensure that all the hard to reach places, or the places where there might not be, easy access of water, like creases and etc. All of those things, all of those places need to be given special attention. According to the Hanafi school, a person does not need to have intention. Because if you jump into a pool with no intention, your wudu gets done. If you jump into a pool with no intention for doing your fard ghusl, but you just rinse your nose and mouth, then your wudu will get done also. Your ghusl will get done also. So when is the fard ghusl necessary? When is the obligatory bath necessary? It's necessary to come out of the state of major impurity that can be caused by a couple of things. Number one, nocturnal emission. Nocturnal emission simply means wet dream, right? So if a person wakes up and they remember seeing something, but they don't see any evidence on their clothes, they don't do ghusl. If they wake up, they don't remember seeing anything, but they see evidence on their clothes, then they do ghusl. So it's based on whether or not you remember, but based on whether you actually see anything on your clothes or not. Okay. So a person has to be very careful, because you can't just go based off of whether or not you remember anything. Okay. Number two, being intimate, even if it's without emission, will require both spouses to be in the state of major impurity, and therefore take an obligatory bath, even if it's without emission. So the mere act of insertion essentially puts a person into a state of major impurity, and a person will have to do ghusl. Okay. Number three, menstruation. So once the cycle has ended and a person is certain that it no longer is going to continue, then they take a shower, and you ensure that all physical remnants of anything is washed off properly. And postnatal bleeding, this is after childbirth. Once the time period of postnatal bleeding is passed, a person will take a shower so that they can start praying again as normal. There's going to be a chapter on menstruation, postnatal bleeding, the basics of it, which is necessary for everyone to know of. I will ask Chef Aisha, because in previous years she had done a workshop specifically for or with the sisters, right? On kind of more detailed issues, right? But we cover the basics from whatever's mentioned in the book.
If somebody is in the period of postnatal bleeding, do they touch the Quran?
So it's considered the same as menstruation. Okay. Yes.
in the book for, I believe, washing whatever is possible. It talks about the hair,
Mhm.
all of one's hair, including the roots, although the roots alone are sufficient for a woman's braid.
So that simply means that when you wash your hair, if it's braided, the most important part are the roots. Because if you were to just if you were just to pour water over your braided hair, because it's braided, it might not reach to your roots. So you have to focus more on the roots and then everything else. But when your hair is unbraided, then whether you're pouring it over the scalp directly or other parts, it reaches your scalp anyway because it's unbraided. Does that make sense?
If someone has like not like an unlimited amount of water, then
Yeah, so it's not just about having a lot of water or a little water, but for even men who grew out their hair, to braid them would not be considered, for them to braid it would be normal. So when you do braid your hair, you don't necessarily do so for just a short amount of time. So to unbraid your entire hair, especially if it's elaborate, it gets very tedious for doing ghusl. So you wash your hair, right? But you focus more on the roots because that's the place where the water is less likely to reach, right? While your hair is braided. Otherwise, it's possible for water to get to the roots.
okay, so it's almost like summer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So the for the ghusl, it's necessary for a few reasons. It's not necessary for more than these reasons, right? So it's it's not something that a person has to do on a regular basis, but it comes around often enough. And obviously, it's necessary to be done correctly in order for you to resume any other act of worship, right? So it's very, very critical for a person to know. A lot of people, when they think of an obligatory bath, they think of it as just a normal bath, which is fine, but usually for a normal bath, you might not think of rinsing your mouth and rinsing out your nose, which is why those things always have to be highlighted specifically. Make sense? Okay. So ghusl otherwise, so not obligatory bath, right? But not just obligatory bath, but beyond that as well. Our ghusl, you can do it for a variety of reasons, as is mentioned in the book, right? There are seven times or places or reasons as to why it is recommended to do ghusl, right? Again, you don't need to have a specific intention. If you don't do ghusl for a sunnah event like Eid or Jumu'ah, right, or Arafah. So for example, on Arafah, when we go for Hajj, first of all, the water is hot, like very hot, because there's no way for them to keep the water cool. They can, but I guess they just haven't gotten to that point yet. But when you go to the stalls there and you're trying to take a shower, the water is warm and it's like over 100 degrees outside. So most people don't bother taking a bath because they're like, if I take a bath, I'm going to come out and I'm still going to be sweating, right? But sometimes you do because it's kind of something that just makes you feel more comfortable for the rest of the day, because usually when we go to Arafah, you're leaving your Mina camp around right before Fajr or right after Fajr, and by the time you get to Arafah, you've done a lot of walking, you're like very sweaty and tired, and you go to sleep. And then when you wake up like around Dhuhr or 11 o'clock or something, you are gonna go and use the restroom. For most people, when they use the restroom, the shower heads are in the restroom, so they'll take a quick bath because they change out of their ihram. They wear like a fresh set of ihram. So a lot of people just take, a shower for that reason, but it's not necessary for you to do so, right? It's good if a person can. For a lot of people, taking a shower Fridays is something that they do regularly. But however, if you are leaving for work in the morning and you're rushing one morning and you don't have enough time to take a bath, and then you're gonna go for Jumu'ah from your work, then it's not necessary for you to actually have to have a bath. Make sense?
Could you make it like Thursday night?
You can.
That would be.
So the day of Friday starts from after Maghrib on Thursday. So our weekly off day in madrasa was from Thursday night to Friday. From Thursday after Maghrib, Thursday after Asr till Friday Maghrib. And the reason why Thursday night was given off, as we were told, was so that you could start preparing for Jumu'ah. So, ironing your clothes and, if you have to do grooming and stuff like that, you do everything on Thursday night, which is kind of what's become a habit for me also, right? So it doesn't have to be literally on the morning of Friday, but from Thursday night onward, it's technically Friday morning, right? Because for the Islamic days, the night comes before the day. So Friday night, that's why in Urdu they call it Jumarat, right? Which means literally Friday night. So Thursday night is literally the night of Friday. In Arabic, they call it Laylatul Jumu'ah for that reason, right? And it's also why when Ramadan starts from Maghrib, because the month starts from Maghrib onward. So if you have to pray Taraweeh, you pray it the night before you fast. Does that make sense? Because the month has already started. And then when you stop Ramadan, you don't pray Taraweeh that night because the month of Ramadan has ended at Maghrib. Does that make sense? So if you do it the night before, then it's absolutely fine, right? For ghusl, water should not be wasted, but enough should be used. So unlike wudu, you cannot, especially if it's the obligatory shower, you cannot get away with using a little, or you don't want to try to use a little water, simply because you want to ensure that everything has actually been washed. So it's better that you use more than necessary, but not to the point where it becomes wasteful. It's very difficult for us because when we're taking showers, for example, you're kind of just, standing under the shower head, and you might technically be washed off, right? But you're still standing there because you're contemplating many things, right? It's a very private space, right? You kind of are thinking of a lot of things, right? A lot of epiphanies happen in the shower, right? So just standing around and like taking extra time for no reason would be considered a wastage of water, right? The last one, impediments should be removed for obligatory bath. So impediments, such as things that would prevent water from reaching your skin, nail polish, for example, that aren't water permeable, should be obviously removed before taking an obligatory bath. Things like paint or ink that might be on your hands, for example, if you're an artist and you have stuff like that on your fingers, making sure that those are scraped off, because very literally speaking, paint or anything like that is on the top surface of your skin, and water is not reaching directly under. Does that make sense? So those things have to be removed. Or anything else that might be considered an impediment for water not reaching that part of the body, right? You don't have to remove jewelry, right? If it's very tight jewelry, then all you have to do is kind of move it around so that water gets under. But, jewelry that aren't typically removed, like, earrings and nose rings and things like that, you don't have to remove them, right? Or any other type of jewelry a person might have doesn't need to be removed so long as it doesn't prevent water from going under the skin, right? So if it's a very tight ring, for example, then taking it off would be best, just so that you ensure water gets under. Any questions?
I guess for women in general, like obviously we can't pray with like nail polish on, and like you can't make wudu with nail polish, obviously. But I don't know if like there's like a breathable nail polish. It's like a new thing that's come out, and I've heard some of them have like a halal certified like stamp on it. But is that allowed to be like? Can we make ghusl or wudu or pray with those types of nail polishes on?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, there are two brands. One is My Halal and one is 786. Don't ask me how I know it. Well, I'm married, so I know it. Yeah. So they've done, I know for Maya, I know they've done testing on it and I actually have friends who did the testing. So it's considered water permeable, and based off of the instructions themselves, they usually say just put one layer and not more than that. So the idea is that if it's just one layer, it's still not going to prevent water basically from reaching under, right? So whoever did the testing, I do trust their judgment. So if it's certified as in yes, it's water permeable, then yes, a person can do wudu with it and pray with it. If a person still feels uncomfortable, they're not sure, then they can follow their best judgment and not have those on, right? Obviously by their nature, they are also easier to remove than the kind of typical nail polishes that you might get, like the lacquer ones that are like very, very difficult to remove unless it's like by like a salon or something like that. So those types of nail polishes would obviously prevent water from reaching the skin or nails. So it's better a person uses the other options if they are comfortable. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So tayammum is what we call a dry wudu. Okay. First of all, you're not trying to do wudu the same way because it's more of a symbolic type of wudu when you are not able to do wudu the usual way. Okay. So it's called a dry ablution, but as we would be doing wudu, that's not how you do tayammum. You're not as thorough as you are with tayammum, the way you are with wudu, because it's more of a symbolic way of getting into the state of purity in order to do your salah or anything else. Okay. So Allah mentions tayammum in the Quran, right? And Allah mentions what you have to do for tayammum. Okay. So before we get to that, number one, tayammum is permissible for a valid shari'i reason. So a valid reason is not what you consider to be valid, it's what the Sharia considers to be valid. So, if a person says going and making wudu is going to be inconvenient, that's not a valid Sharia reason. Or I feel uncomfortable going and making wudu, that's not going to be a valid Sharia reason, right? So valid Sharia reasons, as is mentioned in the book, for example, extreme coldness, and we're talking like hypothermia levels, right? You're, hiking, right? And you decide to camp out, right? And you have to make wudu in the morning, right? For example, and it's not about whether or not you have enough water, but for you to use water to do wudu would cause you to get sick, right? Is that cold, or you're like in Antarctica, right? So it'd be difficult for you to make wudu. So you don't do wudu, you do tayammum, right? So what that tells you is that tayammum, this is in the second point. We'll get back to the first point again. Second point is tayammum can be done in the presence of water or in its absence. Usually when we think about tayammum, what do we say? If I don't have water, that's when I do tayammum. But even when you have water, if there are legitimate reasons, you can do tayammum. So it's not about whether or not water is present or not present. It's about whether you can use the water or not, or whether you have access to the water or not. Does that make sense? So in extreme cold, there might be water available, but you can do tayammum. If you are a traveler and you have as it was in pre-modern times, people traveled with a limited amount of drinking water for themselves and their animals, in case they weren't nearby any water sources. You wouldn't use that water for wudu because you need it for drinking. Does that make sense? So you have water, but despite the presence of water, you're still doing tayammum. Okay? Illness. A person can be extremely sick to the point where they're not able to even touch water. They'll do tayammum. Right? There are certain rare illnesses where a person is allergic to even touching water, right? So in those very rare scenarios, a person just tayammum. They don't have to do wudu, right? So it's not about whether or not you can, whether or not water is present or absent. It's about whether or not you can use it or access it. Okay. Other permissible Shari'i reasons in the book. For example, if you are about a half-hour walk away, right? That was the first one, Hashemite legal mile, which was 1.16 miles, right? If you are that far away from water, then you don't have to kind of travel that distance to get water to make wudu, but you can just do tayammum, right? If you are traveling and you stop in a place where you're trying to pray salah and you don't know if there's water up ahead, and you make tayammum and you pray. 10 minutes later, you come across water, your salah will still be valid because you didn't know there was water up ahead, all right? And, but as soon as you are able to access water again, your tayammum is now invalid, right? Because that breaks your tayammum, okay? So that's it's not impossible today, but it's improbable today simply because on your GPS, for example, they usually tell you there's a gas station ahead, or there's like a stop ahead or whatever. There might be vending machines and there might be like water bottles or whatever. So it's reasonable for you to know where there's water ahead. So before you actually make that decision of making tayammum, you have to ask yourself like, okay, am I that far away? If you're still like half-hour drive away, for example, that's definitely more than 1.16 miles, right? But being away for 1.16 miles by car is literally what? Less than 2-minute drive. Does that make sense? So you're not going to say I'm 1.16 miles away from a water source, but the book has said 1.16 miles, so I'm not going to go another 2 minutes further and actually get water. So you don't do that. Okay. So converting the distances and things like that, you have to keep in mind it's based off of how travel was done in those days, right? So even when you look in traditional books of fiqh and they talk about mil, which they would say translates to the Roman mile, and the Roman mile is basically how far the legion soldiers would march or something like that. That's very different from our definition of what a mile is, right? So you can't do a direct translation or a direct conversion because a lot of other things have to be taken into account, right? I remember when we were studying, we came across one scenario where, for example, if a person is in a town, there is water available, but the water price is prohibitively high. So again, keep in mind what that means in that context. When people traveled they traveled with a limited amount of money, or they traveled with what we would call like IOU slips, right? Like they basically withdraw money at another location, which is like a primitive bank system, right? Today, you have access to your money all the time because it's either on your phone or it's on a card. So it might not be a question of, it might have been a question of money at that time. So for example, if water is usually 1 dirham and you're traveling with 10 dirhams total, right? And you come across water that's being sold for 5 dirhams, you would blow half your travel budget on just water. So that would be considered a prohibitively high price, right? Versus when you can afford it, and for example, in the airport, waters are $7, $8, right? You look at the all the different brands of water, right? You have the 50-cent bottles, and you have the couple of dollar Evian bottles, right? Or the Voss bottles, right? Or I tried a lot of they all taste the same, right? Some of the bottles are more nicer than others, but they're still water, right? Um, you know, it's whatever. So if a person doesn't, if a person can buy a $6 bottle of water and for them it's not a problem, and you use that to make wudu, then yeah, you don't do tayammum. Does that make sense? But if you're like strapped for cash and you can't literally afford to buy a bottle because it's priced out or it's very high, and it happens, for example, in times when supplies are low, the prices get jacked up, right? So if it's water at that time, right, it's unethical, but you're not obligated to break the bank to buy water to make wudu. You can just do tayammum. Or if you need that water to drink, right, there's no running water. So say, for example, in places where they have natural disasters and the plumbing is out, the electricity is out, and you need water just for like basic things, right? In those scenarios, and the price is like really high, in those scenarios, you would use water for basic necessities like drinking water, using the bathroom, cooking, and things like that, and you would do tayammum. Does that make sense? So it's not about whether or not you whether water is absent or present, but rather if you have access to it or not, or if you can use it or not. Okay. Being far from water is about 1.16 miles, which is about a half-hour walk. This is in the book. And how do you do tayammum? You do it by using a pure substance of the earth, right? Pure substance of the earth. So the book has more details, but simply put, we use things like soil, dirt, stone, things that are made out of clay, like bricks, for example, anything that is considered to be made of the earth, right? So there's a specification of, for example, you can't use tree bark, or you can't use trees because trees are consumable by fire. They can be burned off, right? So you can't use that. A lot of times when in popular conception of tayammum, people think that there has to be like a layer of dust or remnants on your hand. You don't have to have remnants on your hand. Again, tayammum is a symbolic wudu, which means you are not trying to use whatever material it is like water. So if you are, for example, placing your hands on sand, you're supposed to shake off the excess. You're supposed to shake off the excess. Why? Because when you wipe it over your face, first of all, you're not wiping it like how you would wash your face. You're not going to get sand into your eyelids. You're not going to get sand into your beard, up in your nostrils, and things like that. You're just lightly passing your hands over your face. That's it. There doesn't have to be like remnants of sand on your face, like how there would be remnants of water on your face. It's a symbolic wudu, right? Which is why you're not even doing the full wudu, because tayammum is literally your face and your arms, which is half of the 4 things that you have to do for wudu. So in tayammum, you don't wipe your hair. In tayammum, you don't wash your feet. You don't wipe your feet. All you're doing is wiping your face once, You place your hands on whatever substance you're using, and then you shake off the excess. You use the left hand to wipe your right arm, and then the right hand to wipe your left arm. That's it. That's all it is. So you don't need intention. You're only doing 2 out of the 4 obligatory parts of wudu, and you're lightly running your hands over your face and arms, right? When you do place your hands on the substance, you're shaking off the excess of it. So you don't use mud, for example, right? You don't use, wet soil, because the purpose isn't to dirty yourself. The purpose is just to, again, symbolically touch what Allah has said could be used as a substitute, because Allah says, Sa'idan tayyiban, right? Sa'idan tayyiban, which literally means pure earth. So you don't use things like metal, you don't use things like wood, you don't use things like plastic, right? You don't, place your hands on like walls, like sheetrock, plaster, right? Because what you're not trying to touch, because people think it's dust. People think that I can just touch anything, and as long as I have something left on my hands from touching it, then I can use that. That's not the point. The point is for you to touch something that is made out of pure earth, right? So a brick, for example, is hardened pure earth because it's made out of clay. Does that make sense? But you can use a brick, but not a clay, because when you touch a brick, you're not going to have a smear of brick on your hand, like how you would have for actual wet clay. Does that make sense? Yes.
Have you seen people carry diamond rocks with them? So it's like the same concept as the brick, like a little.
That's the idea. I don't think it's necessary. It's not necessary for a person to do so, right? Yeah.
When you say it's not necessary, you mean like?
So sometimes it might be necessary. So say, for example, somebody's in the hospital, right? And they just had surgery, or they're bedridden, they're not able to get up or use the restroom, or if they're able to go to the restroom, they're not able to make wudu, and they don't have somebody to help them make wudu on the bed, right? Which is doable with like a bedpan or something like that, right? But if they have a brick, or they have something to do tayammum with, then that's fine, right? So yes.
You might have answered this already, but so let's say somebody is 1.16 miles, about a half-hour walk, they don't have access to water, but it's the beginning of Salah, and they have like 2 hours to pray. They could hypothetically make it to their destination and then make wudu. Do they then have to wait till they get to their destination?
Yeah.
And then make wudu?
Yeah, because even though the time of Salah has started, you still have the entire time of Salah to actually pray. So that wouldn't be a reason. What would be a reason is if the time of Salah is running out and you're still that far away, then you would do tayammum and pray so you don't end up missing the Salah. But for your next one, by the time you reach that water source, you now have to do wudu, right? You cannot combine wudu and tayammum, which simply means you can't do half-half. Because if you're able to do some wudu, that means you're not able to do tayammum at all, right? A person can't say, for example, I'm going to wipe over, my feet, and we're not talking about the wiping over socks, right? I'm going to do tayammum on some limbs and wudu on some limbs. You can't do that, because tayammum is only possible when wudu is not possible. When wudu is not possible, right? So what breaks your tayammum? What breaks your tayammum is not mentioned here. Although I should probably add it. What breaks your tayammum is anything that breaks your wudu. Anything that breaks your wudu breaks your tayammum. So, for example, using the restroom breaks your tayammum, right? Passing gas breaks your tayammum. For the Hanafis, if you have flowing blood, which means if you have a nosebleed, for example, or if you have a cut and the blood flows out, then your tayammum has broken. Everything that breaks your wudu breaks your tayammum, in addition to having access to water. So as soon as you now have access to water, you no longer are able to do tayammum. Does that make sense? As soon as you have access to water, you no longer are able to do tayammum, and your previous tayammum is now broken, and now you have to make wudu for your next salah. Okay? Yes.
Use the ground, or it's like paved or tiled over, that's dusty, and it has dirt on it, is that sufficient or is that not?
Yeah, so not the tile itself, because tiles are made out of other materials, so it would have to be, you know, actual earth. Right?
It says like dirt, sand, limestone, or dust, even the dust on clothes, and then it says that is provided the dust is visible on the hand after rubbing the garment.
That's a lot of dust, right? So we're not talking about like, you know, just stuff that might be on your clothes and kind of floats around in the air or something like that, because there's dust everywhere, right? But you know, if it's to the point where you actually see it, that's what's being mentioned, right? And that's not in many scenarios, right?
Like, oh, sorry, for example, like you have like mud kicked onto your pants or something.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Yeah. Because the mud has dried off and now it's like earth, essentially, right? It would, but it has to be sufficient, right? So, you know, for example, if you wipe your finger over a surface, you might come away with something. Would that be considered sufficient dust? No. I mean, at the very least, if you were to place your hands, you would at least see some stuff on your hand. Does that make sense? So it's not typical, right? It's not usually the case, but it's something that's possible to use. And you know, like natural elements are more readily accessible, right?
Are there instances where, let's say due to an injury, somebody would, wipe parts that would normally wash during wudu?
Yeah, that's gonna come up next week when we talk about wiping over socks. So the chapter after that is wiping over casts. So yeah, you would just wipe over it if the cast is non-removable.
But you wouldn't do something like tables.
No. Yeah. So in that case, you're not combining wudu and tayammum. What you're doing is you're doing wudu and you are just wiping over the part that you are not able to wash directly. Like a cast on your arm that can't be just taken off. Does that make sense? So we're going to talk about that, because then you go into like, what about if you have a band-aid on? What about if you have like a cast that's, you know, like cloth and that's just there to hold your wrist in place, for example, because you had a sprain. So you have all these different types, and not all of them would just allow you to wipe over.
Somebody's sick and if they're home, but they can't make the any service.
If they can't have anybody help them make wudu, then
Sorry, I forgot to ask this when we were talking about this, but because, so you were saying that you don't need intention for it. So, for example, like, let's say like you're pretty certain that you're done with your period and it's time to start praying. Or sorry, you're not certain, but you make the list. And then, you know, like, I don't know how much time goes by and you realize that, okay, I need to pray, you can go back, even if you didn't have the intention for that one to be list, you can go back to that, line pure.
yeah, I mean, as long as a person's shower has washed everything that is required of an obligatory bath, it gets done whether a person had intention for it or not, for the Hanafis. Right? So you don't have to. So same way when a person comes out of the shower, they're already in a state of wudu, according to Hanafis, because the limbs that you would have washed for wudu have already been washed. So it doesn't require a separate intention for it to count as a wudu as well. It's gonna come up next week, but it always depends on whether or not it's removable and whether or not removing it would cause further harm. So, yeah, so you're not supposed to, which means you'll wipe over it. So you would basically wipe over the cast portion and you would lightly wash over the rest so that whichever part is exposed is actually washed. And again, our definition of washing for wudu, as we saw last week, was using enough water that you have at least 1 or 2 drops separating from your limb, right? Yes, you don't have to do a separate wudu while doing a shower, because in the course of taking a shower, you end up washing your face, your arms, your feet, your hair is wet. So those parts already get done, even if you don't separately rinse your mouth and rinse your nose and things like that, because those are the sunnah parts of wudu. And we're talking about like a normal shower. For an obligatory shower, you have to obviously do those 2 as well. But in the course of taking a shower, those wudu limbs end up getting washed, so the wudu gets done, right? Automatically. All right. So 8:45. Let's take 5 minutes, and then we'll continue with our creed class from last week. We'll get a little bit ahead, and then we'll continue with that tomorrow also, inshallah. Exactly. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadi alladhina istafa sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man wala amma ba'd. So we started lesson 8 last Friday of the creed class, which is about the signs of the Day of Judgment. And we started discussing obviously the minor signs, and I mentioned last week that you'll find pretty much near identical lists like this floating around on the internet, because they're all collated, compiled from the sources, and they come up to around 50 or more than 50. Some signs could be considered separately, others are considered to be together or one and the same. But nonetheless, we're talking about the ones that are the most widely known. We talked about all of this up until earthquakes will increase, and it will be considered to be a sign of the nearing of the Day of Judgment. So time will pass more quickly, right? So the idea of time passing more quickly is not just, it's not the idea that people will have less than 24 hours or that the clock is literally moving faster, but time will have less barakah, right? And if you think about it, time can pass more quickly in various ways because everyone has the same amount of time. Like all of the geniuses of the past, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, had the same 24 hours, had the same average lifespan, but they used that time efficiently versus the average person today, who might blow a couple of hours on, a couple of episodes on Netflix, and you might not even realize that you're just wasting a couple hours that easily, right? So time passing more quickly doesn't have to mean like the clock is literally moving quicker, or that you have less than 24 hours, but simply that time is not being used efficiently. There's less barakah. We have all of these types of gadgets where the purpose of these gadgets is optimization. It's for you to spend less time on other stuff than and to spend more time on the things that you like doing. Well, it really hasn't made us that efficient. It really hasn't made us, that optimized, or if it has freed up some time, it's taken up by other stuff, right? So time passing more quickly, is a sign of the Day of Judgment. People always talk about, for example, that they don't have enough time, or there seems to be too little time in the day. But, if a person was to really sit down and figure out where their time is going, there will absolutely be time that a person can utilize much more better, right? All of you have the same 24 hours a day, right? But students who are, for example, struggling to keep up, not because they have more responsibilities, but because they're not using their time efficiently, versus people who have more responsibilities but are still keeping up with their work because they're just using their time efficiently, right? So number 19, tribulations, fitan will prevail. Different types of fitna. Everything is a fitna. The greatest fitna, or one of the greatest fitnas that was experienced by this ummah was from the time of Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, right? The civil war between Ali and Aisha radiallahu anhuma, and then between Ali and Muawiyah radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, that afflicted the community in a way where the split is still being felt till this day, and it's weaponized till this day. But there will be fitan from outside of the Muslim community. There will be fitan within the Muslim community. There will be fitan within every household. There's fitnas in relationships. There's fitnas in every aspect of life, right? And every fitna, calamity, is anything that takes a person away from Allah, or anything that can distract a person from Allah, right? And anything that really shakes a person's iman, right? So, a lot of these things are kind of increasing in variety and quantity, right? Number 20, bloodshed will increase, right? So this is similar to what we talked about last week. Not necessarily, but number 20, bloodshed will increase, right? And we see this obviously not just in terms of warfare, because the wars today are horrendously magnified and widespread and much more effective in killing than the wars were in pre-modern times, right? When you had even empires fight in pre-modern times, and they fought over the course of a few days, it was always armies against armies, right? Combatants against combatants, unless it was directly attacking like a settlement or directly attacking a city. Innocent civilians were pretty much out of the way, right? But you kind of have this warfare, philosophy now where everything is distant, right? And one of the problems with something this horrific being distant is that you can be clinical and cold about it, which is why drone strikes, for example, might not seem that different from a video game, because all you're doing is pressing a button. Or you don't even see like a thermal image, or you might see like, approximation of somebody's location, and all you're doing is lining up the plus sign and then you're pressing a button. It's not the same as driving a sword through somebody's heart. It's not the same as shooting an arrow to somebody directly in front of you. It's not killing someone directly whereby you actually feel the pain or the trauma of actually doing that, right? But when it's that separated and clinical, then it gets more and more easy to do because you don't see the devastation in front of you directly, which is why it's amazing when you have like these drone operators, they have families, they have people that they love. So how is it possible for somebody to like clock in work, kill a few people on the other side of the world, like children, and then go hug their own children at the end of the day, right? It's mind-boggling if you think about it, right? But it's possible because it's become so cold, it's become so distant, right? One of my favorite comedians is George Carlin, died atheist, right? But brilliant social commentator, right? So Carlin has like this entire bit of where he talks about wordplay and he talks about language being changed. So he was saying like how, after the First World War, when soldiers were coming back, the trauma that they experienced was called shell shock, right? And he said it's like very short, 2 syllables. It was like it gave the message of what trauma they felt, shell shock. And then from shell shock, it changed to battle fatigue. So it's a longer, more syllables. It sounds nicer than shell shock versus battle fatigue, and now it's even longer, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So when you say it like that clinically, it kind of masks the real harm under something like that versus something that's very direct, right? A lot of our language has become about covering, right? We don't like using direct language, right? Sometimes, because it's considered inappropriate, other times is because it's considered politically incorrect. But the idea is that we use language to mask and cover. And what happens is when you do that, because when you have like headlines that say, X number of Palestinians killed. Well, why do you have a passive voice, right? Or when you say X number of Palestinians died, or a building collapsed. Well, who collapsed the building? You have that type of language because it distances you from the type of emotion that you might get from a direct language, right? So bloodshed will increase because not just of the technology of killing gets better, right? Just not because the technology of killing gets better, but because there's less and less consideration for the sanctity of life, right? And it's not necessarily one thing that leads to the other. There's a host of things that lead to it. There's mental illness, right? But you have to say that the amount of mass public shootings, school shootings that you have is not the sign of a healthy society by any measure whatsoever, right? Like it takes a very special type of mentally ill person to go into a school and shoot children, right? But to have it that frequent and to have it that, to have it be, that often is something that you might not have considered in the past, right? So bloodshed will increase in multiple different ways, right? Number 21, a man will pass by the grave of another and wish he was in the latter's place. This is something that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, right? In the hadith. In other words, a person will say that it will be better to have passed away. It would be better to be dead than to be alive right now because of the difficulties or because of the circumstances of the world. Number 22, trustworthiness will be lost, not just in the very literal sense that you won't know who to trust, but also it's interpreted as when authority is given to those who do not deserve it, right? When authority is given to those who do not deserve it. This has always been the case, time immemorial, right? Especially when you have things like hereditary rule, whether a person is qualified or not, they get to rule. But increasingly, when you kind of see the IQ level of most elected officials, and when you kind of see the kind of things that they try to use to galvanize their base, is more and more regressing to the stupid side of the spectrum, basically, because most people don't like intelligent debate. Most people don't like sophistication. Most people will try to avoid anything that is too complicated or too complex or requires them to rethink their conclusions, their worldview. Most people will like things that are very simplified. They like things black and white. So it's very difficult to complicate things, right? Like, oh, here's a freedom fighter versus a terrorist. Okay, what defines each one? And then they don't want to talk about it anymore. So when you kind of push people on issues, they don't talk about it, and then they don't want to think about it. And then when you look at the kind of political, circus that kind of happens with ads and things like that, a lot of it is very short. It just talks about buzzwords, anything to galvanize a base based on a few things, right? And it's all superficial stuff. Nobody really debates issues. If you were to compare like presidential debates from like the 60s and 70s versus today, which is like literally like two kids in a playpen throwing toys at each other. That's kind of the equivalent that we have today, right? When you have, somebody like Trump, for example, who is so very easily able to, run for the highest office in the land, that doesn't just speak to that speaks on multiple levels, but also just the fact that authority is being given to the people who don't deserve it, but also that people are willing to give it to those who that they can connect to versus the ones who can actually do something, right? But leadership across the board, for the most part, you could say, are people who are hungry for power, authority, position, money, fame, whatever it might be. It's not about doing public good, right? So amana is trustworthiness is lost in multiple ways. It's not necessarily about, oh, I can't trust this person. That's also the case, right? Not everybody knows who they can trust because, people can kind of, be very, very disingenuous, right? So, but beyond that, it's interpreted as authority is given to the people who don't deserve it. Number 23, people will gather for prayer, but we will be unable to find an imam to lead them. So number 23 is a direct result of number 14, where knowledge is taken away by the people of knowledge passing away and ignorance will prevail. So to the point where people won't know even the bare minimum of their religion. Okay, because it's one thing to try to pray on your own, but when you try to tell someone to lead salah, they'll say that, I don't think I can, which is part of the bare minimum requirement for every male, for every adult male to know how to do the basics of doing adhan, doing iqama, leading salah, because it's next person up, next man up when it comes to stuff like this. You don't need an imam to lead like a short salah, right? But when when people are unable to do even that, it kind of speaks to the level of ignorance, right? Or the fact that religious authority will be even less and less, and they would literally not be able to find an imam, right? Also a possibility. Any questions? A lot of these are very self-explanatory. They're part of the present category because we see these things around us. As I mentioned last week, not every sign is a one-off sign. Some signs are one-off. They only happen once and that's it. Other signs are recurring, and the ones that are typically recurring are the ones that increase in severity. So they get worse and worse, okay? So, knowledge being removed from people doesn't happen immediately. It happens gradually, but compound ignorance makes it worse, right? People get more and more ignorant, and then they don't realize that they're ignorant, and so on. Number 24, the number of men will decrease while the number of women will increase until for every man there are 50 women. I mean, this is mentioned in the hadith, but generally speaking, it doesn't have to be a ratio of 1 to 50. The idea is that there will be more women than men. It could be for multiple reasons. It could simply be that there will be less boys being born, but also just more generally, if you think about bloodshed, who are the ones that get packed away to other parts of the world to fight on behalf of countries? Men. So when you have like increase of warfare, you have increase of loss of life. And typically those end up being soldiers who are usually men. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility. All of these are connected to each other in some way because none of these are happening in a vacuum. They're all affected by the same set of factors, right? The world is getting worse, and everything is what we would call a cascade of failures. Does that make sense? Everything affects everything else, right? Guys, I mean, I realize, seminary might not be that important or that high up on the list, but do have some decorum in the class. Like, I'm not going to tell you don't have your laptops open to take notes, but if you're going to do something else, you're distracting others also. Yeah.
Kind of less interesting. You said the number 24. I remember seeing an article in August, and I just searched it up right now. And it said the Y chromosome, which plays a crucial role in determining male sex in humans, is shrinking. Science has just made an article or a study or something, and it's saying with over the past 300 million years, has lost 1,393 of its original 1,438 genes, with only approximately 45 genes.
Yeah, right. So, that's basically a corroboration of what we're finding in the hadith, right? But even without such corroboration, any person would probably be able to say that the ratio is more women than men, right? And it could be for various reasons, right? And it could be natural or it could be man-made reasons, right? So genes disappearing obviously is not a man-made thing. That's a natural thing, right? But every time we see something like this, Sadaqa Rasulullah, right? The Prophet of Allah has spoken the truth. Number 25. So this is one of those signs where it's difficult, and we came across one or two last week also. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what the Prophet said and exactly when it would happen because it's very cryptic, right? So say, for example, number 25, the Euphrates River will reveal a treasure of gold. And many will die fighting over it, each one hoping to be the one who gains the treasure. Some have kind of interpreted it. They have interpreted it figuratively, and they've said that it's not literal gold, but it's basically liquid gold, as in oil, because the Middle East has been kind of the center of warfare for the last half a century because of the discovery of oil, right? And colonization has always happened because of resources, and it's specifically happening in the Middle East because of oil, right? So is it possible that the Prophet was talking about the discovery of oil? Maybe. Is it possible that the hadith is talking about a literal discovery of gold under the Euphrates River? Also possible. We do know that the Euphrates River, for example, is shrinking slowly, right? So a lot of water resources are kind of shrinking and becoming less and less. So, people who are not sure about the idea of there being something literal will say that, okay, but it's not like an ocean, and we have like sonar technology and things like that, and we should have been able to detect something by now. Allah knows best, right? Because if you can apply the same logic to the wall of Ya'juj and Ma'juj. Where is this wall? Where is it hidden? We don't know how, is it in another realm or something like that? We don't know. So you don't discredit the wording of the Quran in order to fit the facts as you know it, but you kind of just say, Allahu A'lam, Allah knows best. So a hadith like this, like the other hadith that talk about signs of the Day of Judgment that are a little bit cryptic, or it's difficult to pinpoint because there could be multiple candidates that fit the bill of interpretation. We're not going to be like definitive and say it's this and not that. Okay, but this is something that comes in the hadith. Number 26, the Romans. So again, when the Prophet ﷺ used the word Romans, he didn't mean Romans as in from ancient Rome or the Eastern Roman Empire, although that's who he is referring to, but it's more so like Europeans, essentially, like, right, that race. Okay, so it's not necessarily just Romans or Byzantines, but rather this group of people. They will come to a place called A'maq or Wabiq, and an army of the best people will go forth from Medina to face them. When did this happen, right? Is it possible that it already happened? Because we did have the Sahaba go and try to face the Roman Empire during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but even though no fighting took place. So is it something that has yet to happen? Is it something that has already happened, right? Allah knows best. But what you kind of see as a common thread between a lot of the minor signs is warfare, fighting, because there's going to be increasing amount of bloodshed and natural disasters and man-made disasters and things like that. A lot of it is caused by fighting, right? Number 27, the Muslim conquest of Rome. Again, not Rome as in Rome, Italy today, or Rome as in the Rome Vatican, right? But eventually the Ottomans did take over Constantinople, right? Which was one of the minor signs, right? Conquest of Constantinople. So what does it mean, Muslim conquest of Rome, right? Does it mean a physical conquest? Does it mean like a metaphorical, figurative conquest? Because, for example, projections of like European countries of like the number of Muslims that are going to outnumber actual native Europeans, or Muslims outnumbering non-Muslims in European countries. The projection is like, okay, by X amount of years, it's a real possibility. Is it through that? We don't know. Okay, but the Prophet ﷺ mentions this as a sign also of the Day of Judgment. The last minor sign before the major signs begin, but that doesn't mean the last of the minor signs, because there are other minor signs that will come in between the major signs as well. But the last of the minor signs before the major signs begin is the Mahdi. So Mahdi, the one who is guided, the guided one, will appear and be the Imam of the Muslim. So we're not going to get into a lot of detail about the Mahdi, but simply put, the Prophet ﷺ said the Mahdi is from his family. In other words, he is from the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ. He will have the same name as the Prophet. So Muhammad, the one who is the Mahdi, will not grow up knowing he's the Mahdi. In other words, there isn't like a child who's kind of like being raised as a Mahdi today, right? But what the Prophet ﷺ says, that the Mahdi will be informed by not necessarily revelation, but by ilham, by inspiration, divine inspiration, that he is the Mahdi, and then Allah will give people the capacity to recognize him as the Mahdi, and people will give allegiance to him. So anyone who claims to be the Mahdi today, right, is not the Mahdi, because the Mahdi is the one who is recognized as the Mahdi, and that's, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, it'll be during, as the Mahdi is doing tawaf, for example, right? So has to be in a very specific place by a specific individual who is not claiming to be the Mahdi beforehand. Whether the Mahdi is already born, is already among us, we don't know. Allah knows best, right? And you don't want to be that close, simply because the Mahdi means the Dajjal is much, much closer. All right. So before we get to the major signs, I thought, so these are future signs, right? So up until number 23, so the way I had put the slides was we had 10 past signs in total. We have up until 23, so 13 present signs. So 10 past signs, 13 present signs. And now we have basically future signs, right? So again, the word future is very, it's not definitive, because it could be happening or might happen. So it could straddle both categories, so to speak, right? But the future signs continue, of course, after the Mahdi appears. So what we're kind of doing, or at least the way I put it together on the slides, is so that all the minor signs are together, and then we'll talk about the major signs, right? So Up until the Mahdi is all minor signs. After the Mahdi, we get the major signs, and in between some of the major signs, we have other minor signs as well, like the following. So these are continuing with the future minor signs that will happen alongside or in between the major signs. So number 21, wealth will become so abundant that it will become difficult to find someone to accept charity. Generally speaking, these minor signs are considered to be after the time of Dajjal, after the time of Isa alayhi salam, that the people will have so much wealth that it will become difficult to find someone who actually needs your help. Does that make sense? Yes.
Earlier you said that the Mahdi coming is the last sign.
The last of the minor signs before the major signs start. These are minor signs that will appear alongside the major signs or in between the major signs. So when we say major signs, it's not only the major ones until the end of time. Does that make sense?
No, I'm still confused on how the Mahdi will be the last minor sign.
So last minor sign before any of the major signs appear. Because up until the Mahdi, there's no major sign. And once
Okay, I got it.
Yeah, so once the major signs appear, the Prophet ﷺ said that they will all appear very quickly, one after the other. But within those, you have the mention of other minor signs because the 10 major signs are also spaced out. We don't know what the timeline is, but we know that they are spaced out to a degree where things will get better before it gets worse again. Okay, so think about post Isa alayhi salam, post Dajjal, post Ya'juj and Ma'juj, when the circumstances of the Muslim community or the world in general is such that wealth becomes very abundant, right? Today, wealth is abundant, but wealth is not accessible to everyone, right? Because wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few. So you have a lot of wealth and you still have a lot of people who are eligible, who are worthy and deserving of being helped, of being given charity, right? But at that time, you won't find anyone to actually give sadaqah to. Number 30, this is something that's already happening. Arabia will become a land of gardens and rivers, right? So if you look at, kind of the geographic history, like almost ancient history of Arabia, it was considered to be lush green irrigated lands, and eventually over time it dried up, like the Sahara was actually once lush green land before it became a desert. So Arabia kind of going back to how it used to be, the Prophet ﷺ said, is a sign of the Day of Judgment. So obviously when you go to parts of the peninsula today, despite it being a desert, it's lush and green because Taif, for example, that's where all the flowers are grown, right? You literally have, ittars, you have like fragrances that are made from the roses of Taif, right? But you go to like different parts of the country, because of like modern day irrigation techniques, there is like a lot of greenery, but that's not natural greenery. When you have natural greenery where there's more rain and there's like natural irrigation and then there is like growth, that's what's being talked about, right? So we're not talking about what you might end up seeing today. So you have this period of peace and prosperity before times get worse again. So society will begin to decay. So number 32, the reason why I put it the way I did is because it's literally a wording from the hadith. So the backsides of the woman of the tribe of those will again sway around the idol of Dhul Khalasa. Dhul Khalasa was an ancient idol that was actually worshipped by the Quraysh, right? And it was specifically worshipped by this tribe, and it was housed in the Kaaba. All right. So if you were to look up like the heritage websites of the peninsula, and you were to even look up the Wikipedia page, other, including like Lat and Uzza, the names that we find in the Quran and Hadith, you're also going to find the name of Dhul Khalasa, right? So allegedly, this was actually destroyed by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab when he and his followers started the Wahhabi movement in the peninsula. So whether it happened already, we don't know. But what's interesting is that this particular sign talks about the return of idol worship in the most holiest of places. Does that make sense? The return of idol worship in the most holiest of places. So, for example, if you go to different parts of the country today, like heritage museums, they'll actually have like idols that that basically they say that this is part of our tradition, right? Which is eerily similar to what you find in the Quran, what you find in the Hadith about them talking about their forefathers, right? So kind of finding archaeological evidence of idols and then putting it up on display and saying that this is what we used to do, this is part of our cultural heritage. You can kind of see the trajectory and why it's not that far off, where you kind of take it as important as your own religion. Because if you go to Egypt, for example, right, you have so much effort into preserving like ancient Egyptian history and kind of like the pharaohs and obelisks and all of those things, and kind of saying that this is our heritage, right? This is our heritage. Whereas it's not a heritage that you are necessarily supposed to be proud of. Yes.
So I have two questions actually. First one, so there's rumors that Allah's Qudus are being worshipped again in Saudi Arabia. They came out at the beginning of the year, so that would be false, right? The rumors.
Allah knows best. Because again, it's not something that happens, it's not something that happens suddenly, right? This type of shift always starts underground and it starts in, like small circles before it starts to get more and more popularized, normalized under different guises. Does that make sense? So for literally, to kind of do the same thing that people do around the Kaaba openly and blatantly from day one, it's not something that you would consider probable. But for it to start off very small and to become normalized and to be explained as part of our heritage, et cetera, you can kind of see where that goes.
And my second question would be about how you said about how some cultures say like heritage, like the Pharaoh's artifact. In Afghanistan, they had the Buddhist temples that were destroyed. Would that be correct act which they did or incorrect? Because there were some people that were like,
Yeah, that's there is very clear-cut rulings of what not to do when it comes to other people's religious iconography, right? So even if it's your own land, you don't destroy like temples and synagogues and things like that, because you allow people to do as they please.
What about destroying the idols?
Ibrahim alayhi salam was trying to remind his people, don't do shirk, right? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, only destroyed the idols in the Kaaba once everyone accepted Islam, but that wasn't from the get-go. Does that make sense?
So for example, Afghanistan is 99% Muslim. So there weren't any Buddhists at the time. So those being destroyed, is that wrong thing? Because the people who were seeing them as like good luck were Muslims, actually. They weren't Buddhists.
Yeah, so they did it because they didn't want people to remain superstitious or to have like this type of shirk.
Exactly.
Right. So that would be a right thing. But obviously anything that was done and is being done is just, shown in a negative light.
So for example,
Yeah, because there was no need. Right. So it's a fine line, because as a government, your job is to ensure that the people are not being influenced by the wrong things, and that you're trying to protect them from doing wrong things. If that means destroying something that is like so Musa alayhi salam destroying like the golden calf, for example, right? Clearly that was not, his people loved it, but he knew that, this can't continue because this is kind of regressing, right? So it becomes difficult because over time, culture becomes part of the religion of a region, for example, right? And people start thinking along those lines. So you would discourage a lot of things that are taken as superstition. Like, for example, like the figure of the blue one eye to kind of, prevent like ayn, right? That's a very cultural Eastern European, like, Greek, Turkish type of thing, right? We don't promote that, even though we believe that al-ainu haqqun, as the Prophet said, that another is real, the evil eye is real. We don't promote the idea of carrying a blue eye around because that's equivalent to an amulet. Does that make sense? Because that can't do anything. Rather, you tell them recite Falaq al-Nas, right? So you don't promote cultural things that might lead to harm, right? So, keeping things as part of your heritage in order to educate is different versus keeping it as a place of pride where you say, this is part of our proud history.
Oh, I went back a bit, so I got this right. So there will be major signs amongst, and during those major signs, there will be minor signs happening as well.
Yeah. The last one, or number 33 here, is an Abyssinian leader with thin shins will destroy the Kaaba. So this is again from a description of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this obviously doesn't happen during the Mahdi's time, during Isa alayhi salam's time, during Dajjal's time, during Ya'juj and Ma'juj's time. This happens after. So, there are differences of interpretation of what does it mean to destroy the Kaaba. If there's nothing to prevent us from taking the literal meaning, then we'll say it will happen literally, right? That society will again decay to the point, or Muslims will become again weak to the point where they won't be able to even protect their holy places, right? The Kaaba is obviously the most recognized symbol of Islam. So this symbol being destroyed kind of shows how close we are at that point to the Day of Judgment, right? Because the foundations of the Kaaba, according to the narrations, were first laid by Adam alayhi salam, right? So from the time of Adam alayhi salam, it's kind of, place and symbolic, the symbolic structure has existed in different forms all the way up until that point. And for it to be destroyed kind of just shows, okay, it's almost near everything being destroyed.
You said that was
It was during the time of the Prophet. Allah knows best. That's why I said allegedly, because this I got from Sheikh Joe Bradford when he first taught the class. I didn't find corroboration. It's something possible, but again, it doesn't have to be that, oh, it was already destroyed, because archaeological digs are always kind of coming up with artifact, because idols were not just like one thing, right? People had their own versions of it all the time, and different areas, because the entire region had the same type of pantheon of gods, right? So it's not necessary that the one that was destroyed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ was the one that somehow remained or whatever, and then was destroyed later. Last of the minor signs, a gentle wind will take the souls of the believers. This is obviously very, very much towards the end. This comes in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says that there will be a wind that basically causes all the believers to fall ill and pass away. And the purpose of it is so that when the Day of Judgment happens, it is only because there's no one left to worship Allah. Because that's what the Prophet said, that it will only happen when there's no one left to take the name of Allah, right? So a lot of the next ones are simply kind of consequences of this, that when the souls of the believers are gone, there's literally no one left on the earth, to take the name of Allah or to say La ilaha illallah. In other words, there's no such thing as Tawheed left on earth. In the hadith, it mentions that promiscuity, shamelessness will get to such a degree that the worst of people will even copulate like donkeys in public, which is not that far-fetched today, right? But there's still some decency, some inhibition, some legal restrictions that prevent people from doing so. But when you have things like nude beaches and stuff that are very legal, right? You can kind of see the trajectory of where it will eventually go, because a lot of the liberal ideologies behind the things that we see, the natural end result pretty much will come up to what the Prophet ﷺ says, how people will be before the day of judgment. And then, of course, the last of the minor signs, and it's called a minor sign, even though it seems very major, but why we don't consider it a part of the major signs, we'll see on the next slide, but the blowing of the trumpet by Israfil. Right, so that's literally the last thing that will happen before everything is destroyed and everyone faints. So except as Allah wills, that's based off of ahadith and based off of the Quran. So there is a difference in interpreting who will be affected by the blowing of the trumpet, right, the first time, because if everything is destroyed, then that will include literally everything, like Jannah, Jahannam, the throne, and the prophets, etc., etc. So everything, and then Allah will say, "Limanil mulkul yawm," for whom is the kingdom today, before everything is recreated again. Others, say that when the trumpet is blown, literally the plane of existence, the realm of existence in which all of us basically exist or existed, will be destroyed. And then everyone will be recreated again in, the hereafter, or in the plane of the hereafter, that realm. What it would look like, what does it mean for everyone to kind of, because we know from ayat and from hadith that people will come out of the earth. So does that mean this earth is recreated again and people will come out? Allah knows best, but what we do know is that there will be destruction, and then there will be recreation, and then resurrection. Okay, so that's the end of the future signs, some of which, as I said, are not liable to happen before the major signs, some of which will happen alongside the major signs, or in between the major signs, right?
Are there any credible books that kind of go through the timelines, go deep into each topic and stuff? Like
there are,
the reason I'm asking-
not as far as I know, maybe a few in English. A timeline is very difficult, because I mentioned last week that the Prophet ﷺ gives us a lot of signs, but not necessarily this one will happen first and then that one will happen first.
You know how over here in the previous slide you said the Muslims will like eventually become so weak that someone will walk in from Abyssinia and destroy the Kaaba. But before that, Isa alayhi salam will come, and there is a prophecy that everybody on earth will be Muslim.
Yeah, but society decaying again means that shirk will come up again.
So from where we are, there's going to be destruction, Isa alayhi salam is going to come, there's going to be victory, and then we're going to go back down into the...
Yeah, because that's the nature of the world, right? It's cyclical. So that's why I said that a lot of these signs are happening in between other major signs, and what they show is that things will be stretched out, because things don't change overnight. Things don't change overnight. It takes time, right? So when you have the Prophet ﷺ saying, for example, that Isa alayhi salam's rule will usher in a time where wealth will be so abundant and you won't find anyone to accept charity, and then it gets to the point where all of this is happening in public, and the Kaaba is being destroyed. You can't just jump from that to that a day later, right? So it happens over time, because eventually people start because shaitan is still there. Shaitan is still there to distract people, right?
Is there a known time period between Isa alayhi salam's time and the blowing of the trumpet?
No, It's very difficult to say that everything will happen within 50 years or 100 years. Allah knows best. There are certain ones that we can say will happen in rapid succession because the Prophet ﷺ says they will happen in rapid succession. But even the ones that do happen in rapid succession are not necessarily just like one day after the other. Right? And when you actually look at the hadith where the Prophet actually talks about the major signs, it's this hadith. There are some other hadith, but more or less all of them talk about the same thing, right? So this is where we're talking about the major signs, and all of them are obviously to happen in the future because none of the major signs have happened yet. So this hadith by Hudhayfa ibn Usayd al-Ghifari radiallahu anhu, he said that the Prophet ﷺ came to us when we were discussing, and he said, "What are you discussing?" They said, "We are talking about the hour." In other words, we are talking about the Day of Judgment. So the Prophet said, "It will never begin until you see 10 signs before it." So because of the list itself, the scholars of hadith say that major signs are very, very specifically just 10. Every other sign is considered by default a minor sign. So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the smoke. Again, what the Prophet lists here is not also an order of how things happen, because we kind of know from other hadith the order of some of them. So the Prophet mentioned the smoke, Dajjal, the beast, rising of the sun from its place of setting, meaning rising from the west, the descent of Isa alayhi salam, Ya'juj and Ma'juj. 3 landslides is considered 3 separate signs. Okay? Some places will translate landslides as earthquakes, like extremely, like literally, earth-shattering type of earthquakes, right? So 3 separate landslides / earthquakes, one in the east, west, and one in the Arabian Peninsula. So these are considered 3 separate signs. And the last of that is a fire which will emerge from Yemen and drive the people to their place of gathering. And this hadith is mentioned in Sahih Muslim. So now, in order to understand all 10 of these signs, a person has to find out what order they might come in. And in other hadith, the Prophet says that when one appears, the other one will appear right after. Right? So the order of only some of these signs are known, and they will appear one after the other. Shaykh Yasir Qadhi's series about the signs of the Day of Judgment is, very interesting. There are certain things that other scholars have disagreed with, but generally speaking, once you start thinking of the possibilities, there's a lot of possibilities when it comes to interpreting some of these signs, because we have so many ways of destruction appearing on earth, right? So when you have like the possibility of nuclear warfare and like literally what we call the post-apocalyptic landscape, right? When resources are very, few and people are just, it's like a lawless society, it might not be that far from the truth, because what happens when infrastructure is down? What happens when there's no, law and order, even though, Democrats don't like that term, right? What happens when there's no enforcement of the law? You kind of, it's like a Mad Max type of terrain, right? Everyone does their own thing. You only look out for yourself, right? So it doesn't have to be that cartoonish, but, people literally, just following their base instincts to survive is not that far off, right? Because you just need to take a few things away, like this idea of the social contract by John Locke, right? Like you take away the idea of the social contract, you take away the idea of political authority, take the idea of ethics and morality and things like that, and just what are you left with? Just do what you please, right? So we'll go through each of the signs with somewhat of a detail, because again, not every one of them has a lot of details. Yes.
Question about the beast.
It's gonna come up, right?
What does it mean by the place of gathering?
So according to the muhaddithin, it literally means where people will be resurrected. So literally the last batch of people that are still remaining on earth before the earth is destroyed are the ones that are going to be pushed in that place of gathering, which according to some is Allah knows best. We don't know. So because it emerges from the south of the peninsula, a lot of people say it'll just be pushing people up north, essentially, right, to what's called mahshar. So how it would look like on the day of judgment, we don't know, because again, people are buried all over the world, right? People aren't only buried in one area. So when you have resurrection and you have people walking, or when you have people being brought to the place of gathering, right, where judgment will happen, what any of this looks like, what does time and place mean in a realm like that? There is no time there, because you're in the hereafter, which is outside of time. So the day of judgment is very long. So what would it look like for people who are like in the furthest corner of the world, right? Allah knows best. Any questions? Yeah.
Was it mentioned? Was that mentioned? Was that a minor sign?
Yeah.
Is that for?
I mean, it's difficult to, so, the great, there are a lot of signs that talk about fitan. There are a lot of signs that talk, because for example, the landslide earthquake is not the only time it'll happen as a major sign, because earthquakes increasing is part of a minor sign also, right? So what is classified as malhamatul kubra, Allah knows best, right? Because because this one is 3, so which one is considered that one? Allah knows best.
Is there ever mentioned this?
So all of the major signs happen from after Imam Mahdi, because this Imam Mahdi's appearance is connected to the appearance of Dajjal, who was the first of the major sign. So up until Imam Mahdi, any minor sign that hasn't happened means that it will appear alongside the major signs or in between the major signs, right? Because you have to think of, because each one of these are psychologically, spiritually, like, literally, physically, these are earth-shattering, earth-altering types of signs. Like the world can't be the same after the appearance of Dajjal. Does that make sense? The world can't be the same after the appearance of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, because and we believe it is the case that, how the Prophet talks about the destruction of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, the world will look very different, right? Post and pre. So we can't kind of think along the same lines as we do currently, because the world looks in a very particular way for us. So the Prophet talking about 3 major earthquakes. We're not talking about small earthquakes. So one of the interpretations of like earthquakes happening on the east and the west is that it'll kind of push people to seek shelter towards basically the middle, and people will be driven up from the south, right? So that's another possibility, right? So is it possible that the people who will remain as the last batch, are they going to be closer in proximity because the rest of the world will be uninhabitable? Because you do have opinions of like scholars that talk about what are the potential outcomes of nuclear disaster, like just thinking about it on a mass scale. When lands become uninhabitable, where do people go? They'll have to migrate, right? So Allah knows best, right? Again, we can't think of all of this happening and everything remaining the same, right? So by the time any of these happen, and by the time any of the major signs happen, we will assume and we believe that the conditions for it will be in place, which means the psychological conditions for people to accept Dajjal will be in place. Because if Dajjal is the great deceiver, all right, how are people going to be duped so easily, right? It takes a long period of time for people to get to that point. Does that make sense? The circumstances in which you will literally have, when you will have literally battle lines between, Isa alayhi salam's army and the army of Dajjal, the world has to get to a certain point for that to even happen, right? It's not like, it can happen today and people are just going to kind of take it for what it is, right? So the major signs will appear when the circumstances for the major signs are in place. And when the major signs do happen, the world will be changing completely from what we know today, because each one is on a literally worldwide scale. These aren't like localized small things that some person on the other part of the world is not going to be affected by it. Does that make sense? So, we have to kind of think along those lines. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so we'll start with the major signs and we'll do at least two of them. So the first major sign, and this is of course following the appearance of, sorry, some questions in the chat. Safe to infer that other events may happen to facilitate a major sign. All right, yeah. Thinking creatively, that's a good thing. When you mentioned that time will feel faster for later generations, can that include that we will sleep longer? It's a possibility. Allah knows best, right? Any way that, because sleeping, sleeping a lot may simply be a biological, physiological necessity in our time than it used to be previously. So today, for example, we're told you should be getting at least X amount of hours of sleep in order to function optimally. But was it the case for every generation before, pre-modern times? Did people sleep at the same amount of time? Because you had people who, would not necessarily be sleeping during the hours of the day, because, the day started literally at the crack of dawn, right? And you had a limited amount of daylight hours to work in, for example, before it would be too dark out, right? Allah knows best, it's possible, right? But you could also argue that, sleeping is better than just, indulging in sin or indulging in other things, right? So definitely. So will Dajjal be so influential that Muslims believers will be at risk of disbelief? Yes. The Prophet ﷺ tells us that Dajjal is the greatest fitna ever created. And it is a fitna that even the previous prophets warned their communities about. Every prophet warned their communities about Dajjal. It is considered the greatest fitna for every believer. And it requires a person being extremely strong and stable and having conviction in their iman to not be duped, right? Because today, for example, if you're just even less critical, you can be duped by a news headline. You could be duped by a news article. You could be duped by AI generated images. Certain things look like very, very fake from the get-go, like Trump having a six-pack. You're like, yeah, I know that's not real, right? Or, if it's like onion.com, you're like, yeah, I know that's satire, but some people will will use like, there's another one called Bumblebee, I think. It's like it's equivalent to the Onion, but it's like by right wingers, right?
Babylon.
Huh?
Babylon.
Right? So some people will use that and be like, oh, look, here, WhatsApp forwards, huge fitna for like boomer generation, right? It's like, my mom sends me a message one day, like, Mahdi is in Pakistan. I say, and she's like, there's a video on Facebook of a guy in Pakistan who's saying he's the Mahdi. And I'm like, anyone who says the Mahdi is not the Mahdi, it's fine. Go about your day. And she's like freaking out. I'm like, no, it's Facebook. There's tons of misinformation floating around. But people get duped by it so quickly, right? So you can imagine when there's literal divine aid behind the deception, which is what Dajjal will have, when it's so convincing. But Iman will allow a person to say, yeah, you're fake. This isn't true, right? Yeah.
This might be like a silly question, kind of like what is the Dajjal? Like, is it like a human?
So Dajjal is considered a human, as the Prophet ﷺ said. He's not like a golem. He's not like a construct. He's not like jinn or anything. Where he comes from, what's his lineage, we don't know. There's obviously tons of interpretations, right? But he is a human being who will be accepted as a leader by everyone who will be on his side, essentially. There are physical descriptions given of Dajjal that, he will have, one eye that is blind and his left eye will be protruding like a grape, basically. He'll have the letters Kaf, Fa, and Ra, like Kafara, Kafir, basically, on his forehead, which will be visible to the believers, right? Certain physical descriptions are given of him, but beyond that, he's not made out to be anything other than a great deceiver, right? Because
will he be like a judge, like like jinn and humans?
no, I mean, he is human, but his deception will be for everyone. For every
day judge, will he like?
Well, no, he's not necessarily going to be held accountable because Allah created him specifically for this, right? Yeah, and people get really deep into it and kind of just say, people get really into it and people, talk about what Dajjal will wear and all that stuff that we don't know, right? Like some people will, yeah, I don't want to get into that. It gets very weird. Has there been any critical analysis of the fitna within the Ummah during Uthman's Khilafah and the Dajjal? I mean, it's not necessarily connected, but so one of the minor signs the Prophet himself said would be his own death. And we kind of see like how quickly the fitna appeared within the Muslim community, which starts basically from Uthman alayhi salam being martyred within his home in Medina. And then that leads to a civil war between Ali and Aisha radiallahu anhuma, and then leads to a civil war between Ali and Muawiyah radiallahu anhum. Right. And then after that, it kind of continues, like his son Yazid comes and attacks Mecca, and Medina fights like Abdullah bin Zubayr, right, radiallahu anhum, and so on. So you kind of see this escalation of fitan that has continuously happened, right? There are historical reasons as to why there might have been discontent and eventually led to the martyrdom of Uthman radiallahu anhu, but in Western academic circles, they'll usually tie to stuff like nepotism and like mismanagement of the empire, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not an approach of adab for the Sahaba, which is why we have to understand why he might have taken the decisions that he did. At the end of the day, the Sahaba were still human beings who at that time didn't have revelation like they did during the time of the Prophet to confirm or correct their actions. So they were just doing the best that they could based on the circumstances, right? And we don't need to dig beyond that because we can clearly see how things ended up happening later on, right? What characteristics existed within the better earlier generations that caused them to fight, assuming these characteristics could also lead towards our deception with Dajjal? It's not necessarily tied because, I mean, human behavior is more or less the same throughout human history. We're all susceptible to the same type of things. The earlier, better generations were just had more constraint. And when they did fight, it was based on legitimate grounds, right? So, you know, the civil war between Ali and Aisha radiallahu anhuma, it was based on what should be the next steps of the leadership, because you want to ensure that the people who martyred Uthman radiallahu anhu are brought to justice. At the same time, you also want to consolidate your support, and not let it fracture more. That was kind of the basis, right? And then Muawiyah and Ali radiallahu anhum had their own differences. Ultimately, they tried to come to mediation, which was sabotaged by the Khawarij, and the Khawarij ultimately tried to assassinate all of them and ended up killing Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu also, right? So it's not necessarily the same things. I would say Dajjal will come, Dajjal will come in a time and will be as successful as he will be, despite his tricks being tricks, is because the Prophet ﷺ says that the coming of Dajjal will be preceded by a tremendous amount of shubuhat, tremendous amount of doubts and confusion, mass confusion, right? To the point where somebody will take Dajjal as God. Like, you have to imagine how easily people might be duped by that, right? And also, it comes at a time when people's iman are also in flux, right? Like, constantly struggling with the changes that are happening in the world, temptations increasing and so on. And eventually gets to a point where, Dajjal has more of an easier task. Because if you had to put Dajjal in any of the earlier generations, you have to question how effective would he have been, right? In the best of generations. Allah knows best, but we say they are the best of generations because the Prophet says they are the best of generations, right? So imagine him appearing that early on, how much effect would he have had versus today, right? So, entropy basically is woven into the fabric of the universe in every sense of the word, like in the psychological, physiological, biological, like there is a countdown that happened from the time Earth was created and from the time Adam alayhi salam was sent here till the inevitable appearance of Dajjal, until the destruction of the world. Everything is entropy. In other words, there's good times and bad times, but generally speaking, the bad times get more severe and longer, right? And it gets more and more frequent. So again, we kind of have to think all of those things together in order to make some sort of sense regarding them, right? So, yeah. All right, we'll stop there. Any questions? We'll go over them tomorrow, inshallah, and we'll continue from here, right? So some of the major signs have details and some of the major signs do not, right? So the ones that do have details, we'll talk about them a little bit. Dajjal, or at least, about Dajjal, there are many different hadith. We're not going to go over all of them. I'll reference some of them. But hopefully we should be able to finish. We should be able to finish lesson number 8 tomorrow and start with lesson number 9, which is predestination, and that will be a fun one. And that's the last difficult one. Lesson number 10 is just secondary issues that kind of wraps up everything that we've been talking about. Inshallah, right? So,
You just made me think, like, when you said, like, the job doesn't have like an afterlife, that Allah created him, he's not like, going to be questioned like a regular human being.
mhm. جزاك الله سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أستغفرك وأتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله
Oh, I have a question. Sometimes when we have like a word that's plural meaning, we use, like when we're doing the exercises, the rock running, etc., the four things. Sometimes we say, oh, it means plural by meaning, but we're gonna call it mufrad. Yeah. Like when we're doing an
Yeah,
exercise.
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. But then sometimes when we put a sifa on it, we say, well, it's mufradun, but we're gonna use the sifa for like the plural version.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's sometimes, is it like just kind of, you can like,
So like, for example, let's use the word qawmun.
Yeah.
Qawmun means people. It is a mufradun word because it has a plural, aqwamun. That's the word qawmun is by its nature.
so Coleman, you would use,
Like for example, even just forget a sifa khabar, right? If I said the people are returning,
yes,
I would say al-qawmu raji'una.
you would say.
Al-qawmu raji'una. Right? For example, Allah says al-qawm al-zalimin. Al-qawm al-fasiqin. So the description is plural, like it's actually a jam' al-mudhakkar salim. But the word is a singular word but has a plural meaning.
Yeah. Are you able to think of a plural feminine word? I'm sorry, like a common one, but non-intellectual? Because I just want to see if
Qawmun, but non-intellectual.
yeah, because then you would you, I mean, if you wanted to say beautiful, would you say Jamilatun? Because
What's the thing?
that's what I'm trying to think of the word.
Like think of something in English. Like, are we trying to say like I know, but like are we trying to find a word like books, but like it's singular with a plural
Say
meaning?
books, yes. So kutubun,
Kutubun jamilatun, jadidatun.
Jamilatun.
But it's kutubun. It's a non-intellectual plural. Can be treated as singular feminine.
Maybe I'm just confusing this.
Right? Kutubun is plural. Yeah. And all non-intellectual plurals are treated as singular feminine, right? So kutubun, jadidatun, jamilatun.
So like, you didn't send it in the chat, too late.
Brett, what did you get on the soda tab?
About min ladun.
There should be. But then there's a main in front of it.
Yeah. So min ladun is kind of like the exception because min ladun is used like with min. And I think there's is it min ladun like right after the table there's like one or two lines about it?
No,
La, la.
Yeah, it says, what's not doing is most preceded by one.
Yeah. Read that, note that min is always
Together, the one and many make up.
yeah.
Let's see that, so it works.
So min is a harfu jar. Ladun, we're gonna technically look at it like a word that doesn't change, right? So it's mabni, but min ladun collectively gives you the verb. Yes, ladun is not going to be sweet.
That she actually printed it on heavy paper. So, all right, wow.
What is it?
That's an expensive test.
Wow. Very rigorous. This is the greatest, this is the best test I've ever had. This is great.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه من استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. Yesterday we finished chapter 8. I'm not going to teach chapter 9 because you guys probably won't pay attention. But just really quickly, I put translation sentences on the quiz. Translate from English to Arabic. You're given the English, I want the Arabic. And there were a few sentences that had this concept on it, and I was tempted to leave it on because I have mentioned it, but I ended up taking it off, right? And I just altered the sentences. But the idea of Ismul Ishara wal Musharu ilay. You guys remember what the Asma'ul Ishara are? Yes? Technically, they were the Asma'ul Ishara, at least they were taken previously. So anything taken previously, we said is fair game, correct? Okay. The Asma'ul Ishara are for Qareeb and Ba'id, they are Hadha, Hadhani, Ha'ula, Hadihi, Hatani, and Ha'ula'i. Right? Dhalika, Dhanika, and Ula'ika, Tilka Tanika, and Ula'ika. Right? Those are the Asma'ul Ishara. The Ismul Ishara wal Musharu ilay, literally the word. So we know what Ismul Ishara is. It's literally the pointer words, the 10 that we just mentioned. The Musharun ilay literally is a word that you put next to the Ismul Ishara to clearly indicate what it is that you're pointing or indicating towards. So for example, if I said, هذا كتاب, this is a book. What type of sentence is that? Jumlatun ismiyatun, yes? Stop. I know I see some of you looking at me, but I can tell you like you're reviewing vocab 8 and 9 right now in your head. Stop it. If you didn't study, it's not going to stick anyways, okay? I'll make dua it doesn't stick if you didn't study. My point is, you're going to say, Hada kitabun, this is a book. Jumlatun ismiyatun, nominal sentence, 2 words. Hada is your mubtada'un, and kitabun is your khabarun. Okay? We're done with that sentence. Now I want to slightly alter that sentence, and I no longer want to say this is a book, because hada kitabun, this is a book. But now I want to say this book is new, right? So originally I was saying this is a book. Now I want to say this book is new. The first 2 words, this book, which is not a sentence, is now basically my Ismul Ishara and my Musharun ilay. And to phrase that in Arabic, essentially, I will now say Hada al-Kitabu. Hada al-Kitabu. The Musharun ilay will always be next to the Ismul Ishara, right? And will have Alif Lam, right? And it will always share the same properties as the Ismul Ishara. So like Al-Kitab is masculine, therefore I'm going to use Hada, right? If I had a whole bunch of books, then it would be Al-Kutub, right? And then instead of Hada, I would use what? Hadihi, and not Ha'ulai. Someone said Ha'ulai. Not Ha'ulai, but I will use Hadihi. Clear? So the Musharun ilay and the Ismul Ishara have to match. They have to match in gender, and they have to match in number. Obviously, if it's books, it's non-intellectual plural. Non-intellectual plural is treated as singular feminine, right? But if I was like at-talibu, right? I said at-talibu, the student, I would say هذا الطالب. At-talibani, not the Taliban, but at-talibani, I'll say هذان الطالبان. الطلاب, I would say هؤلاء الطلاب. Clear? So going back, I want to say, I said هذا كتاب, and this is a book. I want to say this book is new. So I'm going to say هذا الكتاب is new. جديد. هذا الكتاب جديد. This book is new. What type of sentence? جملة اسمية. هذا is playing what role? No, now we're looking at the entire sentence. It's, yeah, what type of word it is, it's an ismul ishara. But what role is it playing in that sentence? هذا الكتاب جديد, it's playing the role of the مبتدأ. Then we have that extra word, al-kitabu. Al-kitabu will get the label of musharun ilayh. Okay? And the musharun ilayh will always be in the same state as the ismul ishara that preceded it. Yes? You agree? The musharun ilayh will always be in the same state as the ismul ishara that preceded it. Now that statement of mine is slightly problematic. Why? Because the asma'ul ishara, are they mu'rabun or mabniyun? They're mabniyun, they don't have states. Correct? Except the duals. Hadani, hadaini, hatani, hataini, dhanika, dhainika, tanika, tainik. But when I say the musharun ilay will be in the same state as the ismul ishara that preceded it, I'm technically not talking about the state of the ismul ishara, but I'm talking about the state of the position. Clear? So هذا الكتاب جديد. I would not say هذا الكتاب, and neither would I say هذا الكتاب B, because هذا is playing the role of مبتدأ, and the مبتدأ is a position of what? رفع. Therefore I'll say الكتاب هذا الكتاب جديد. مبتدأ الكتاب مشار إليه جديد خبر. Clear? One last example. You say شرب to drink. شرب محمد الماء. شرب محمد الماء. Muhammad drank the water. Verbal sentence. جملة فعلية. شرب محمد الماء. شرب فعل ماض. Past tense verb. محمد فاعل مرفوع. الماء مفعول به منصوب. Okay. Now say Muhammad drank this. Just say Muhammad, don't say Muhammad drank this. Just Muhammad drank this. شرب محمد هذا. شرب محمد هذا. Full sentence. Still. فعل ماض فاعل مفعول به. Now say Muhammad drank this water. شرب محمد هذا الماء. Clear? شرب محمد هذا الماء. فعل ماض. شرب محمد فاعل. هذا what? What? مفعول به. مفعول به. Yes, اسم الإشارة is a type of word it is. But in the grand scheme of things, هذا now مفعول به, and الماء what? مشار إليه. Someone's going to ask you, well, هذا الكتاب جديد. You made الكتاب مرفوع, and it was the word after هذا, and over here you made الماء منصوب, and it was the word after هذا. What changed? They'll tell you هذا didn't change, and they're right when they say هذا didn't change. But you'll respond and say, but the position of هذا changed, and the role هذا was playing in the sentence changed. Therefore, the word after it would also change states. Clear? Similarly, if you had something min, right, and then you had right min, once again, min هذا الماء. Min هذا الماء. Clear? So that is basically اسم الإشارة والمشار إليه. Clear? So if it's on the test, then oh well. This is what it is.
Is that badal?
No, it's not badal.
One day we'll get to
But badal doesn't use. It's the same, like essentially it's the same concept. It is the same concept. If something could be confused, it could be, right? And they are replacements of each other in the sense that when I say هذا الكتاب جديد, I could simply say Al-Kitabu Jadidun. But I've lost part of my meaning here because I'm no longer indicating or pointing to the book. Right? In the Balad, it's like I gave the example before. It says, the hadith will say, عن عائشة أم المؤمنين, on the authority of Aisha, the mother of the believers. Al-Mu'mineen over here is Aisha radiallahu anha, right? Clear? Okay. We'll teach this next week, inshallah. Hopefully it goes well. I am personally feeling a dip. I'm feeling there's a dip.
Like in what?
I'm worried. I'm worried about certain students.
Like going into Thanksgiving break?
Yeah, and I feel like we haven't gone to Thanksgiving break. It's next week is actually the last week of October. October's been a long month because it's 5 weeks, 5 weeks of school or 5 weeks of seminary. I'm feeling a dip. Sorry, I'm not feeling a dip. I'm sensing a dip. Huh? Told you the suggestion box, man. Just use it. Any thoughts that you have, anything that you believe, just put in the suggestion box. It gets checked every week. I don't know what day, but it gets checked every week. And more room is created for more suggestions. Okay. For those of you in person, I don't know if you heard, but I was gonna make several bad jokes, but it's probably the nicest test you'll ever take. It's been printed for some reason on very, very thick paper. Most of you will not be able to. Only a few of you will be able to claim it. Those of you online, I will post it online within the next 2 minutes, inshallah.
Don't know whatever. Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna feel bad writing my paper.
Maybe next year, first year students, like the first quiz, I'll purposely tell Sister Sarah, print it on construction paper. And then when I pass out the quiz, I'll say, guys, don't start flipping through the pages. Like I'll only make it 2 pages. They'll think it's really thick. So I'll say, don't flip through the pages, guys. For those of you online, it is now on Sycamore.